Hi,
Hi,
how are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for pulling this together.
Yes, thanks for being here. It looks like we've got about 73 people on the line. I think we're pretty, I think we'll have about 80.
Yeah, terrific.
So you've been home for a few days, I hope.
Yes,
Good.
and doing calls like this, it's been really good. Just getting on the phone with different groups. We actually made a lot of progress with the CARES Act, and there's some aspects that are specifically designed to help nonprofits, and I look forward to explaining those and taking questions.
Great. Okay. So maybe that's a pretty good place to start. We could start with questions, which I know you have some of our questions. Do you want to just kind of give us an overview of what the last couple of weeks have been like? And yeah.
Sure. Yeah, happy to, Liz. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I first want to say, you know, this is a difficult time. So many businesses, nonprofits, individuals have been impacted. We've seen necessary steps taken to close all kinds of organizations for public health reasons. But I just want to communicate to folks, we're going to get through this together. And the work that the nonprofits do is so important to keeping the fabric of our communities together. And we've had to take these steps to essentially push the pause button on our economy in order for public health reasons. And the steps we've been taking in Congress have been focused on making sure when we take our finger off the pause button and the virus passes and we push the start button on the economy, all organizations, nonprofits, for-profits, restaurants, construction can open their doors back up, and we can get back to some form of normalcy. So I think the biggest piece of information is the bill, the CARES Act, that passed just at the end of last week. I was in Washington. I got to speak in favor of the bill on the floor. We moved with a remarkable speed through the Senate, the House, and the president has now signed it. There are a couple of things in that bill that I just want to highlight because there'll be a particular assistance to nonprofits. And the first one is the forgivable loans that are now available. These are SBA 7A loans, and they will be administered through all FDIC insured banks and credit unions. I was speaking with Secretary Mnuchin last week, the Treasury Secretary. He said the one-page application for these 7A loans will be in the hands of bankers by the end of this week. And what's significant about these is they're designed to help both for-profit and not-for-profit organizations keep their employees and pay the payroll. So if you, normally a 7A loan is just that, it's a loan. However, the special attribute here is that they've been broadened to make them available to nonprofits. And if you take a loan and then you use the proceeds of the loan to pay your employees or to pay rent or to pay utilities, and there's a couple other things you can use them for. If you use the funds for those purposes, the loan amount is completely forgivable. So it is a grant to nonprofits to make sure you keep your doors open. So that's item one. In addition, there's been concern about charitable giving. I know we discussed this with your members in the past. There is a provision in this CARES Act that allows for a $300 charitable deduction on your taxes, even if you don't itemize. So this was something that was not part of the reform we did before. It is now part of this package. So that should be helpful. There's a whole bunch of other elements, but the message I want to communicate up front is we had to take this decision to preserve public health, but we've also then had to pass these programs to make sure the economic support is there for individuals, families, for-profit businesses and not-for-profit organizations to make sure that when the virus passes, and it will pass, we can get back to some form of normalcy and people's doors aren't shut. For individuals, it's really the expanded unemployment provisions that are important in this bill. We have and it's been, unemployment historically has only been available to employees of organizations. Under this CARES Act, it's extended to sole proprietorships and even independent contractors. So as an example, we have there's a gal here in Bozeman, she's a widow, she does nails, and all of her appointments canceled. Well, normally she would not be eligible for unemployment. Under the CARES Act, she is. So we're going to make sure people have food on the table, they can pay their rent or mortgage so that people can get back on their feet when this virus passes. And again, that's my encouragement to you. We are going to get through this, and we're going to get through it together. So that's a quick overview. I'm happy to talk about other points, but I think we're better off hearing from folks and what's on their mind.
Thank you. Do you have before we kind of go to the questions, do you have what's your sense of the trajectory and the timeline?
Well, I get daily briefings from the CDC, NIH, and others. We're going to see more cases before we see less. When I was talking to Dr. Fauci here about 2 weeks ago, he said the number to really focus on is the number of new cases being reported. And that has not started to go down yet. So we're still on the upswing. I'm optimistic seeing what has happened in Korea. Certain countries have done a better job than others in responding to this crisis. I think we've taken some early steps. We're fortunate in Montana that we haven't had the size of outbreak we've seen in other places. Still tragic to have the loss of life. And today we learned a second and maybe a third person have lost their lives here in Montana. But we also have, we just normally socially separate a little more than like downtown New York City.
Right.
And that works to our advantage.
From an economic perspective, so when things start to stand back up, do you think repercussions, assuming things just kind of run the way we would expect with a stand-up, is that like through the middle of next year, end of 2021? I mean, how long does it really take a kind of a society to recover?
Well, you're asking me if I have a crystal ball, and I don't.
I'm asking.
But I will say, my gut is I think our economy gets going faster than that. I really do think these, again, talking to the medical experts, these viruses are seasonal. We're probably going to see some return next fall. However, by then, we already have 2 antibody treatments in clinical trials. We went into this with, as the medical professionals say, with no herd immunity, right? Mm-hmm. But as people get it and recover, they're now more able to fight the virus. So we'll get better and better at it over time. And by this time next year, we'll probably have a vaccine. That's not guaranteed, but we have a couple of vaccines starting into clinical trials already. So I'm betting on American ingenuity to come up with solutions. And I think, honestly, this is a bell curve. The precautions we're taking are really to flatten that bell curve so we don't overload the medical system. Mm-hmm. But it will pass, and we'll get back to some form of normalcy.
I appreciate your sharing the crystal ball with me. I know that's not fair. It's what we're all talking about around the dinner table, Yes. And so it is an attempt to have some sense of security, which is false security, but I appreciate you sharing your thoughts.
But one other thing I'll point is also in this CARES Act is direct payments to individuals, which I didn't mention. So everybody who has a Social Security number that earns $75,000 a year or less is going to get a $1,200 check in a couple of weeks. Couples will get $2,400 plus $500 for each dependent child. Mm-hmm. So a family of 4, it's over $3,000. If I had my desires, we would see the bell curve spike soon, decline, families would have this money and they'd all decide to come to Montana for the summer vacation.
That's kind of funny because I would decide just the opposite. They would all go somewhere else for vacation. Okay, so I see some unemployment and personnel related questions. We'll get to those at the end, but and MNA will be monitoring those questions, and just know that we have an HR firm that we've contracted with that will be having class hours, I guess you'd say, or office hours twice a week with us. So stay tuned for that, but that's probably where we'll refer some of these HR and unemployment questions to. But let's see how it goes.
Okay.
So one of my questions is, you mentioned the work with the SBA. There's some sense that the SBA may not have capacity to handle the onslaught. What is your sense of that? And is there any movement afoot to give them more capacity in the short run?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it is a concern because government and efficiency don't always go together. And the SBA in particular has been known to not move that quickly. Right. And that's why I think the steps that we're taking here, instead, although it is an SBA program, it's not going to be administered by the SBA. Every FDIC insured bank or credit union can write these forgivable loans. So you don't have to call the SBA. You should call your local banker, and they should have the paperwork by this Friday.
So I think as you know, one of the challenging things is that many nonprofits have never applied for a loan. And there are the disaster loans, then there's the payroll protection thing, and maybe that's the same as the 7A. I mean, there are all these different buckets, and what we know is that, like, if you apply for this one and get funding there, then you cannot apply for funding in this one. So a navigator kind of role is pretty important. Do you think, will the banks have the technical, and I know you don't necessarily know this, but do the banks have the technical assistance to help nonprofits figure out which avenue is best for them? Maybe a little bit different than for business.
Well, there are a couple of programs that overlap, and you have to pick one or the other. You can't run you can't be deducting payroll from to keep your employees on while you're doing a 7A loan. I have a call. In fact, I'm speaking with the nonprofits on this call prior to my call with the bankers this week. So you're getting the earlier information. That's one of my next calls. But they're in the business of helping organizations figure out what's right for them. But there was a decision made not to, we couldn't start a new program because new programs take months to stand up. So we used existing programs, and Secretary Mnuchin has been, I think, smart in broadening who can administer these loans, going to really all banks and credit unions. And I would encourage you, I'm happy to make contacts with you with the Montana Bankers Association or the independent bankers. And maybe there's somebody who could do a call and explain some of that to your members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great idea. So in terms of health supplies, one of the questions we offered you was that Montana needing its fair share of the supplies as they become available, especially all of the hospitals in Montana, but the acute or the critical access hospitals. So what is your office doing, or how are you advocating for making sure that Montana is lined up to get a share of the supplies?
Yeah, well, we have some real hot spots in the country. I had a call last week with 50 hospital presidents across the state and senior living professionals. And that was one of the questions: what do you need? And there was all expressed concern about the PPE, the personal protective equipment, gowns, masks, hand sanitizer, but no one was out. And there are parts of the country, we see what's going on in New York right now, where they're setting up emergency hospitals in the Javits Center in New York City to deal with all the patients. I think we have to keep a handle on it. There's a firm here in Bozeman that just emailed me about they have a large supply of the N95 masks, which are so important for nurses and doctors to be protected. But the feedback we're getting at this point is there are some shortages of testing, but there have not been shortages of this PPE in Montana as acute as we've seen in other areas of the country. There are resources we can draw on if necessary. The Montana National Guard has stockpiles of this. DOD has stockpiles, but at this point, the national stockpiles are being released for California and New York. We don't have a crisis here yet, and hopefully don't have one.
So in terms of thinking beyond phase 3 to what's next, and there's talk of a phase 4. What are your priorities as you think about a phase 4? What are you thinking about?
Well, we're learning the first phase was really about making sure the resources are there for vaccine research and testing. Phase 2 was about protecting workers with expanded unemployment benefits and making sure small businesses are kept whole in the process. Phase 3 was, unprecedented in its size, $2 trillion to help small business, nonprofits, individuals, some larger businesses, make sure we can open up the economy. I think, Liz, again, I don't have a crystal ball. Every day we learn more. I want to watch where the needs are, and then I'm happy to act based on Montana's needs.
What is the chatter about paying back the $2 trillion? I mean, on the one hand, there's really no choice. This is the only path available.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's a perilous path too.
Yeah. I'm at the head of the line of fiscal conservatives. That being said, I voted for this $2 trillion bill because it was necessary to essentially push the pause button on the economy. It would be irresponsible, and it was the government that made that decision. It would be irresponsible to not provide the support to families and individuals and small business to not help them open back up. Because if the cures end up being worse than the disease, it's going to take a lot longer to recover. That being said, this gets added to the existing national debt that we have. One thing that Washington has not demonstrated an ability is in fiscal discipline. So I don't have a great answer there for you, but this was necessary to make sure Americans can get back on their feet again.
Yeah, it's kind of like just do the next right thing and then see what happens. Would you consider, in the phase 4, would you consider supporting a temporary larger charitable giving incentive? I know we had asked for, I think, a $2,000 one or something like that. Would you consider supporting something like that to keep philanthropy, personal philanthropy playing a role?
Yeah, well, as we've discussed before, I supported this $300 above the line deduction, even for people that don't itemize. We'll have to take a look at it. I think the best thing being, take my congressional hat off for a second, being one of the largest foundations in the state and very involved in understanding the importance of the work that your members do, we've got to make sure we have a vital nonprofit community. The most important thing in the intermediate or long term is to make sure we have an economy, because America has a great history of philanthropy. And if we need more incentives, we'll look at them at that time.
Yeah, okay. I've been thinking a lot about, I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. I've been thinking what allowed, and I am not an economist, okay? I'm backgrounds in social work, so that tells you everything you need to know. But I've been thinking about what allowed China, to supposedly or reportedly kind of bounce back fairly quickly. Although I understand, they're dealing with the worldwide economy and all of that. And I kind of went from that to thinking about the role of the nonprofit sector in the United States and how we are a layer in the economic strata that is different than some other countries. We don't just have kind of business and government and nothing in between. We do have this layer of nonprofits that are so important. Any thoughts about that? I mean, I know you're tremendously supportive.
Well, you mixed a bunch of things in there. I
Yeah.
think that in relation to China, we now see these images of people going into retail stores and buying stuff, and there's been no new cases in 6 days. First, I would say I'm not sure you can trust all the data we get out of China.
Sure.
We don't really know what the situation is. Clearly, it's better than it was. Is it completely fixed? I don't know. And you're right. America has a tremendous heritage in charitable giving. Americans have big hearts, and they're willing to support when they've taken care of their basic needs first. They give out of their surplus. So ultimately, a strong economy is the best thing we could do for the nonprofit sector.
Agreed. I've never seen so clearly the interrelationship between all three parts, government, nonprofit, public, or private. It's interesting to see it. So one of the things that is on our minds is Census 2020. And, Montana, 40% almost are PO boxes, and they get 0 census materials in their PO box, if that's their home address. And, the leave behind is stalled out, the enumerators are stalled, all of that is stalled out. And we are working with households that have used their workplace for internet rather than home having internet. And so the idea of just, this is a great time to, while you're home, to go on and fill out your census form. Montana is positioned to have a really unfair disadvantage, if you will, through no fault of anybody's. But do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, we're in uncharted territory. I know there has been some real concerns about the census enumeration on the reservations, given some of the challenges we have there with people not necessarily being receptive, somebody knocking on the door. And this just further complicates it. But, we have a constitutional requirement to take a census every 10 years, and apportionment of funds, as well as the number of seats we have representing us in the U.S. House, are all dependent on this. So we need to get it right.
Do you have any thoughts about advocating for whatever it takes, I guess, for Montana to have a fair shake, given the disparity that exists with the PO box and internet situation?
Clearly I do, and I will. I don't fully understand that issue yet, but we need to make sure everybody's counted so that Montana gets its fair share.
Okay. It's a real worry. We've been working on census for the past several months, and we were kind of relying on the leave behinds on doors because we knew that the PO box thing was an issue. And so now it's like we're left with not really knowing what else. So any advice from you for nonprofits in the nonprofit sector? This is an opportunity for rethinking and creativity and innovation. Do you have advice just from your perspective?
I'm an optimist. I know we're going to get through this, and I know that we're going to get back on our feet. The work you do is vital. I would encourage you to communicate with your supporters and your beneficiaries, who, in whatever ways you do this. I mean, we're learning about Zoom and conference calls and other alternative ways to stay in touch with folks. I mean, people are socially isolated right now. And it's interesting. I'm spending my days talking to people all over the state, small business folks, healthcare professionals, local government officials, all folks. And honestly, what people need to hear is that we are going to get through this, and this will pass. And it's going to be different when we get on the other side. And honestly, I think it's going to be, it's going to change us. And I think some will be for the better, some not so good. But we're going to get through this together. And the work that the nonprofits are doing is as vital or more vital. And I would just encourage you to continue to communicate with your supporters. They want to hear from you.
Mhm.
And I would just find other alternative ways to reach out.
Do you have, is there a way that we as a nonprofit sector can be of help to you in your work, in your office, in your work?
Yes. I mean, we hear about needs all the time. We have a number of, and I can get you some of these links. If nonprofits are doing work, particularly in making PPE equipment available, we've seen a number of for-profit businesses convert their operations, like Wild Rye Distributing is now making, distilling is now making hand sanitizer in Bozeman. We had some dentists and high schoolers repurpose 3D printers to make face masks and to protect healthcare workers. So I would say if you have imaginative ideas like that, that's great. And again, I think folks across the state are uncertain. They are scared about what's going on. And they need to hear a calming voice that says, hey, it's going to be okay. And if you are in the arts, there's no better time to find alternative ways to consume beautiful things because it lifts our spirits. So I would just encourage you to be imaginative in your service to the great folks of Montana.
Thank you. I've seen a number of questions come through about unemployment and the CARES Act that I think MNA can respond to. You know, one person asked if we've already had to lay off people, can we still qualify? I think MNA can respond to those, and whether you can use the 7A loans to pay independent contractors, we can do that.
Yeah, and so the unemployment benefits under this, typically they wouldn't be available to contractors. Under this CARES Act, they are available to contractors and sole proprietorship. So the definition of employment has been expanded to include people because we want to, the goal of the legislation was to help organizations preserve their relationship with their existing employees. Again, think of it as we pushed pause on the economy. At some point in the future, we're going to take our finger off the pause button and push the start button again. We want the engine to fire up. We want all the organizations to open their doors and people to go back to employment if they haven't been maintained. So there's a number of different aspects here, whether it's expanded unemployment benefits, these employee retention grants available to nonprofits, the fact that you can defer payroll taxes through the end of the year. There's a whole bunch of different elements that hopefully push a bunch of cash into the economy to keep the gears turning, even though not all the revenue's coming in.
Great. I think that probably the hardest thing for nonprofits is just navigating all that, understanding the technicalities of it. We're trying to offer, well, we are offering twice a week an HR expert on the line, just like this. I think we capped those out at 50 attendees. And as long as we need to do that, we will. And also access to that resource library for HR purposes. Tomorrow and the next day, both of those days, we have SBA folks. Tomorrow, not SBA, but tomorrow it's Prospera, which understands the SBA access rules and process and can help us. And then the next day it is SBA on the line. And so I think, you know, we'll continue offering those resources. And then Congressman, I think for us, we'd like to just occasionally email you the results of surveys or what we're hearing. We're pulling together a small group of about 12 or 13 nonprofit leaders from across the state, each of who are connected to, like, one in domestic violence, one in early childhood, one in the arts. So we'll have information, kind of boots on the ground information in real time with a whole community. And so just know that we'll pass that information along if that's helpful to you. And
yes, very much so.
we really appreciate your work. I don't know if, do you know how the amount of an SBA loan for nonprofits will be calculated?
Yes,
Okay.
It's a little complicated, but think of it this way. The forgivable portion, that is the part that's a grant, is about 8 weeks of payroll.
Okay.
Right? So you can get an SBA loan for more, but anything over the forgivable amount, you're going to have to repay with interest.
Okay.
So that's, again, a conversation with a banker would help you. And again, by this Friday, Secretary Mnuchin said there will be a one-page loan application up on the internet that someone can fill out and email to their banker, and they say they can do this loan over the phone in about an hour. So they're trying to make it, that is the goal of Secretary Mnuchin for these 7A loans. But the forgivable amount, again, there's a couple of ways you calculate it. It can't exceed $10 million, but it's about 8 weeks of payroll is the amount that's forgivable. So the goal is to help nonprofits and for-profits keep their employees through this dry patch until we can get the economy started again.
Okay. There's a question about families and individuals only needing a social to get the care dollars. So just to clarify, families and individuals don't apply for the loans. It would be as a business or even an independent, like a sole ownership or something like that. You apply for it through the business realm. The care money that's included for families is to individuals, and I don't know what, do you know?
So that's a good question, because the money going to individuals is going to be direct deposited in their account.
Okay.
And I believe they're working through payroll vendors to do that. So that'll come directly. The SBA loans is a separate program that businesses or nonprofits would apply for.
So what if somebody's unemployed or doesn't have a checking account? Which is the case for many, well, not having a checking account is pretty common for service industry and folks in poverty.
Yeah, so I don't have the specific answer to that.
Okay. Well, that's a good one for us to flag. We'll see.
Yeah, that'd be a good question. Because the goal, again, is to help people get back on their feet.
Yeah.
And to include everybody that's participating.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any other questions you want to send through? Here's a comment. World Montana is the only nonprofit in the state of Montana which brings international professional visitors to our state for 34 years through the State Department programs. Our grant depends on the amount of visitors and on COVID-19 now. Please vote for not decreasing the budget for IVLP programs, otherwise World Montana has to disappear. I don't know what IVLP is, do you?
I think it's the International Visitor Program.
Oh.
The one we're advocating for.
International Visitor Leadership Program. If World Montana can tell us what IVLP is, that will be helpful. And the turnaround time on the 7A loans. I've heard that it takes a bit to apply, and then you would expect 2 to 3 months even for getting the money.
That if we were doing it through the SBA, that would be correct.
Oh, but it's faster than that.
This we're doing through the banks, and these are structured. I mean, there's a commission in here for the banks, so they actually have an incentive to write these loans, and they have the means to fund them, and then they're marketable loans. I mean, so we're using the commercial banking system, which is able to move much faster than the SBA is to get this money out there into the economy.
That's great. Now, do they have to go to the SBA does it funnel still through the SBA, but via banks instead of people?
A nonprofit would only have to deal with their local bank or credit union. Any communication with the SBA, the bank would take care of.
Okay, all right. And then I think there's another question on phase 4. Any idea what might be included in a phase 4 package? But we kind of already addressed that.
And it's out there a little. I just got a note today. We're in daily conversations with leadership back in Washington, but they've already told us we're not going to go back until at least April 20th.
Great. Okay, that's good. And then there's a question about, and this came up a couple of times, I think MNA can respond to this tomorrow in the HR call. If some staff have been furloughed, which would be like a job attach, can a business still apply for 7A loan for the wages of staff still working? My understanding is that they would be able, if it's a furlough, they'd be able to apply for everyone's wages.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And there's a couple of rules. And again, your HR person could talk about this. It's like, when you calculate the amount of the loan, is it last month's payroll average or some average of last year? There's like 3 different ways to calculate it. Whichever number is greater is the one you use.
Okay. And if you have people still working, can you include their wages in that loan?
Yes.
Or, okay, great. Because it's a work incentive program.
Yeah, you want to keep them retained.
Yeah, okay. Anything else you want us to know? And now's your last chance to the community for, oh, wait, I do have another one. We're worried about our nonprofit organizations that have increased funding needs to keep the feeding programs running. Will there be extended funding for statewide programs like Montana Food Bank Network, Montana No Kid Hungry, for purchasing and obtaining additional food in addition to SBA?
There were in some of these bills, there has been additional subsidies for nutrition programs. And I'm not the expert on that, but we can get you that detail so you can get it out to
Okay.
folks. I believe it was phase 2. There was particularly some nutritional supplementals for both the elderly and for kids that are home from school that aren't getting lunches at school anymore.
Okay.
That was in phase 2, I believe.
Okay. I think that, you know, just looking at the surveys that we've done, the most compassionate and worrisome aspect of this is children who are home and unprotected. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing really Congress can do about that, but it's just people kind of have their heart on their sleeves about that.
Yeah, and I hear that talking to people every day. It's just, you're right. There's only so much government can do. I mean, we're going to put these safety nets in place, but ultimately it's going to be up to each one of us, both nonprofits and just citizens, to pull together so that we can get through this as a community.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. The last question I want to ask, and we kind of talked about this before, do you have a sense of how robust the support is for Indian country?
Well, I lobbied for additional funding particularly for Indian Health Services, IHS. I was pleased those funds were released. I think originally it was a 40 million. I think we pushed it to 80 million. And we've been in communication with the Department of Interior on this issue to make sure Indian country doesn't get forgotten.
Okay, thank you. Really appreciate your time. I know it's been a double haul for you, and so thanks for representing Montana.
Well, it's my pleasure. And again, my message is we're going to get through this together.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think communicating like this and you doing these calls every day with your members is so vitally important. And if there are additional questions, don't hesitate to reach out to our office. We're available and we're open for business.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And for all of you on the call, thanks for joining us. If you have additional questions as time goes, just email them directly to the Congressman's office, or you can email them to us and we'll send them on. And thanks all for joining us.
Thank you, Liz.
Take good care.
Mm-hmm.